Stop buying canned wort for your starters. Don't get me wrong, canned wort, like proper, is an amazing product and makes brewing starters really easy. But what if I told you that you could can your own wort for starters for about 30% of the cost of a proper? You can take that money you save from buying proper and get better ingredients, or put it towards a new purchase for your brewery. So let's go. Okay, let's kick this off. You're gonna wanna watch this whole thing if you're planning to try canning your own wort, because there are definitely some gotchas that we're gonna cover throughout this video. I'm gonna take you from spending about $5 a can on proper to $1.30 for the cost of making your own canned wort. Any equipment you need to do this will eventually be paid for in the savings that you realize from doing it yourself. Don't miss our experiment using lab grade testing equipment to test VDK and diacetyl levels in a Pilsner I brewed using genetically modified yeast. So anyways, I'm gonna take you through this whole process of canning wort and show you how I do it. But before that, let's talk about risk and how we can mitigate these risks. A big concern you're gonna hear a lot in canning is botulism. Yeah, I said the B word. Botulism bacteria actually thrives in an anaerobic environment, much like you'd find in a can of preserves, or in this case, wort. This is also why we don't worry as much about botulism on brew days, because we aerate our wort before we pitch yeast. It is not quite an anaerobic environment until the yeast actually takes up the oxygen. Pressure canners allow us to boil at 250 degrees Fahrenheit by applying about 15 pounds per square inch of pressure. And this means we can eliminate any botulism toxins or chance of infection. You could also neutralize these things by boiling at 212 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 hours, but if I had to boil that long, I'd probably just buy my starter wort. There are other ways to do this, involving a water bath and acidifying the wort, but it's still not as safe as pressure canning, so I'm not going to be covering that today. On top of all this, if you have a pressure canner, that means you have an autoclave that you can use in your brewery, and that's pretty cool. All right, so let's talk about the things you're gonna need to can your own wort. And all these things will have links in the description if you need to pick one up. First, of course, is your pressure canner. I use a smaller one, and it's a Nesco 9.5 quart pressure canner. This is an electric canner, and it costs about $100 and will fit about 4 16-ounce mason jars. If you want something bigger, I'd recommend a 23 quart pressure canner, although they won't be electric. You'll need to do it on your stovetop. Again, I like mine electric because I can use it as an autoclave in my brewery. Next, you're gonna need dry malt extract. Today, I'll be using Golden Light DME. That's because it's what I had on hand. If you wanna take this cost down even further, you could just brew an all grain batch with the sole purpose of canning it, and probably spend around 70 cents per can. You just have to be sure to boil that all grain wort for about 15 minutes. This is because DME has already been boiled during the process of production, so we don't have to worry about it there. Next, you're gonna need some mason jars. I use 16-ounce jars, much like the size of a proper can, and concentrate my wort gravity to about 1080, which means if I mix the contents of that jar with another 16 ounces of water, I'm going to end up with about a 1 liter starter. If you're expecting to do a lot of lagers or high gravity beers, you could also use 32-ounce jars in order to get a 2 liter starter out of each jar. I would not concentrate the wort beyond about 3 times. You're also going to need a scale that can measure in grams. And finally, a yeast nutrient. I recommend yeast nutrient for good reason. It really has the best variety of essentials for yeast health out of any nutrient I've looked at. So let's get started. You never want to use a jar or a lid that's damaged in any way. You want these things to be perfect. Next, you just need to wash out the jars with a little dish detergent. I like to place all the jars in the sink at once and hit each one with some detergent. This is just to get anything that's not supposed to be in there out. Once that's done, you add some water. I like to agitate the solution by moving the faucet like this. Now it's time to scrub each jar. And I use a bottle brush because it makes it so easy. And finally, we need to rinse the jars before we can work with them. As usual, I tend to go overboard with rinsing and spend the extra 20 seconds rather than ruining whatever I'm working on. Okay, so here's a view of where I'm gonna be working today. And for the first time in a while, it's not the brewery. So we're gonna need to clean this place pretty good if I wanna use it again. Let's start making our starter wort. So the first step, obviously, is going to be grab some DME. And we're gonna add about 90 grams of DME to each 16-ounce jar. Like I said, this is going to achieve about a 1080 starting gravity, and it's definitely considered a concentrate. So it's meant to be mixed with water later. And it's the same concentration proper uses, by the way. And because we're using a 3-pound bag of DME, that means we can get about 13 starter cans out of this one batch. And because the bag costs $18, we're spending $1.38 per can. Yes, so now it's time to add a little nutrient to each of these jars. And there's nothing scientific as far as measurement here, just add a pinch. This is just to help yeast reproduce more healthily when we actually use this for a starter at some point. Now we have to top each jar up with water. You're going to want to leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of headspace in the top of each jar. I've noticed I have to let the solution sit for a minute or two and then top it up again because the DME will absorb some of that water, bringing the levels down. You can use RO, spring water, distilled water, or tap water if it's not treated with chlorine or chloramine. So after filling with water, I clean up the edges of the jar just to make sure there's a good seal for the lid. After this, you just need to place the inner lid on top of the jar and screw the lid ring on what's called fingertip tight. That means just until you feel resistance and then a touch more. We do want some steam to be able to escape during this process. Now we're going to need some hot water for the canner. And nothing crazy hot. It could be 180 degrees and I've used 200 degrees with no problem. This specific canner calls for 16 ounces of hot water in the bottom. So we're at the easy part. We just need to put the jars into the canner now. And like I said, with this canner, you can fit about 4 16-ounce jars. I tried for 5, but it was way too tight. I didn't want to risk it. Now, you just need to close the lid and lock it in place by turning it. I always check to see that it's locked just in case. Press the pressure cook button, the high button, and then set the time to anything from 15 to 20 minutes. And press start. So now look at the top of the canner and check the weight. It should say exhaust, airtight, and then exhaust again. You want this to be set to exhaust right now. The black weight is what you should use unless you live above 1,000 feet above sea level. If you do live 1,000 feet above sea level, use the green weight. So now you're just going to need to wait for the canner to heat up. And that could take about 20 to 30 minutes before you move on to the next step. Keep in mind, steam's going to come out of this thing like crazy while it's heating up. This is totally normal. So after it heats up, you're going to hear a beep and the display will read E10. This is a countdown. Each number represents 1 minute. And when it reaches E0, you're going to turn the weight to airtight. And there's no need to press any other buttons at that point. The canner will keep heating a little bit after you turn it to airtight. And then it's going to beep when it actually starts the real timer that you set before. Again, you're going to see a lot of steam at this point, and this is totally normal. So when the canner's done, it'll beep 3 times, and the LED display is going to read off. At this point, you want to wait 45 minutes to 60 minutes before you try to open that pressure canner. Right behind the weight, there's a little red button. You definitely need to wait for this button to drop down before you open that canner or it's going to blow in your face. This is a safety feature they added so you could visually see if the canner was ready to be opened. Also, these jars are going to be hot when you open it, so make sure you have some good gloves. All right, so it's been about an hour. Let's go take those jars out. Okay, I've got my gloves. I'm pulling these out and they are super hot. I'm just tightening the rings around the lid. This is to help it get a good seal because what's going to happen as the liquid inside cools down and the air cools down, the volume is going to shrink slightly and it's going to create a vacuum inside the jar. That's exactly what we want. So tighten those rings and then set the jars out and allow them several hours to cool down. It'll take a while. Once the jars are cooled down, you want to check each of the lids by pushing on the top. If you hear a pop when you push on the lid, that means the process didn't work for this one and the seal didn't take. So you're going to want to dump that wort for that one jar and do it again or scrap it altogether. If you don't have a good seal, the wort won't keep. The other option is just toss it in your refrigerator and use it within a couple days. And once they have totally cooled down and sealed, you can take those rings off and use them for another jar. All right, yeah, so that's pretty much it, guys. Make sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss that next video. We're going to do the DKO experiment using professional lab-grade equipment to test diacetyl and VDK levels. I am really excited for that one. I'll see you in the next one and never stop learning.